I'm going to talk a bit about the ethos of hacking, after which Sal is going to take over and talk a bit more about technical aspects, and then finally we'll have Marissa talking about the politics of hacking. I want to start here with this headline from Wired magazine. Hackers trick facial recognition logins with photos from Facebook. What else? This is actually quite an interesting story about hackers who have taken images of people's faces from Facebook that are publicly available, and then they've stitched them together into a three-dimensional rendering of their face and their head, such that they can then use that to trick facial recognition software, which is these days increasingly used for security, as are other kinds of biometric data, like fingerprints and things like that, not to mention iris scans. But somewhat to many people's surprise, actually this kind of biometric data is not terribly secure. This is true not only for the fingerprints that we see stolen in myriad ways and replicated with rubber fingertips in the movies, but this is actually interesting to us for a slightly different reason, which is the question of who are these hackers to whom this article refers. Well, if you scroll down a little bit, you find there in the second paragraph highlighted in blue that by the word hackers, this author is actually referring to security and computer vision specialists from the University of North Carolina. Now, that doesn't exactly sound like the prototypical vision of a hacker that I think of, and so that got me really thinking about, well, what is hacking and who is a hacker then, if the word can be used to refer to a bunch of academics. So I'm going to start by giving a little prehistory of hacking, then I'm going to move on to the origins of the word hacker, and finally to talk about something I'm going to call false binaries. The question of who is the first hacker is, especially considering how amorphous the term is, a little bit difficult. And I'm not going to suggest that this person is the first hacker, but he is, I think, an interesting precursor to what we mean by the term today. That's a gentleman by the name of Rene Carmil. Now, in some ways, he's going to seem like a pretty unlikely candidate for being a hacker. He was Comptroller General of the French Army, but he ran the demographics department in Vichy France under Nazi occupation, including punch card machines that were used for the census. Now this is where it gets interesting. He sabotaged his own machines, specifically in column number 11, which was where individuals' religion was recorded, and in doing so saved the lives of an untold number of Jews. Now, for that reason, I'm going to suggest that he was a kind of hacker avant la lettre, right? You know, the earliest computers were punch card machines. I mean, earliest computers actually, we could argue about the question of whether those were the earliest computers, but an early form of computer before the digital computers were used today was the punch card machines, and including these that he was using in the 40s to record and tally the census. And I think of this as a hack partly because of the element of sabotage. He broke the system on purpose, and for that act of resistance, well, he was caught and eventually found his end in Dachau. So, I'm now going to talk about someone who's very different, but is also a kind of precursor to the vision of a hacker that we might think of today. That's a man named Joe Ingressia. So, Joe was born blind into a really unfortunate and abusive home situation, but he was a very talented child. He had perfect pitch, and he found some respite or escape from his somewhat troubled life in the phone system, even sitting up late at night just listening to the dial tone. And by age 7 or 8, he had gotten much and much closer to the phone and had learned to terminate calls by whistling at precisely 2600 hertz, which you may recognize 2600 as also being the name of um, the magazine for a famous magazine for hackers, and that is named for this fact. And so he could whistle that to stop a call, and if he whistled that tone for a very short period of time, he could then generate a number of other tones and actually then call people, because the initial whistle terminated the call, but it didn't completely end it back to the dial tone as one would normally finish a call. So he and a number of other people who learned how to essentially hack the phone system went oftentimes by the name phone freak or phone hackers. And they weren't all whistlers like Joe. Some of them used blue boxes, which were tone generators. There was another man who became famous for discovering that one could use a toy whistle that came free at the bottom of a box of Captain Crunch cereal, ever so slightly modified to hit that 2600 hertz pitch and hack into the phone system. Joe, quite interestingly, decided that he wanted to work for the phone company, but in order to get their attention, he committed some very public crimes where he essentially hacked the phone system, but did so quite deliberately and great length and very publicly, so that they would have time to catch him and be able to do so. And in so doing, he wanted to get their attention. So, somewhat surprisingly, that actually worked, and he got a job at Ma Bell, though it was fairly short-lived. And he's a very interesting guy. I can't really go into his personal story, but he left Ma Bell and changed his name to Joy Bubbles later in life, and was actually listed in the phone book that way. So, next I'm going to talk about the origins of the word hacker. So the OED offers this sort of general definition that seems most aligned with our interests. A person who attempts to gain unauthorized access, especially remotely, to a computer system or network, or, in earliest use, as we just mentioned, a telephone network. The first reference to this term hacker that they offer when the term is being used in this particular way is from a 1963 issue of an MIT journal, where they say telephone services have been curtailed because of so-called hackers, so on and so forth. Now, looking at another source, Edom Online, which is an excellent online dictionary of etymologies, they suggest that there's a convergence of two different origins of two different words, hacker, coming together here, where the first is a person hired to do routine work, which comes about around 1700 and appears to be short for Hackney, coming from the place Hackney in Middlesex, England. This is probably most familiar to us from terms like hack writer, which I very much embrace that term as a former journalist and proud hack, though it is sometimes used in a more derogatory sense. Then there's this second separate etymology of the term, which comes from the verb to hack, to cut roughly, cut with chopping blows, in these different senses of, I can't hack it, which is American English, and then to get through by some effort, as in keep working at something, keep hacking at it. I think that our contemporary uses of the term hacker, with reference to a kind of person using computers, or to hack as a verb for this activity related to computers, combines some certain aspects of those different origins that I have just mentioned, but it also has some very complicated sort of cultural colorings, which I want to get into now for a couple of minutes before I hand this over to Sal. I'm going to get at these through what I'm going to call false binaries. Now, setting up binary distinctions as straw men just to tear them down is, in some sense, it's a bit intellectually cheap, but I wanted to move through this material fairly quickly, and I think this is quite a useful way of illustrating some of the apparent contradictions in our cultural notions of hacking and hackers. So one issue is the question of the outsider versus the insider. And, we could see that even in the earliest person we discussed here, Rene Carmille, because he was on one hand an insider. He was working for the military and the Census Bureau and the government, but he's also an outsider in the sense that he was resisting that system and he was sabotaging that system. This idea of sabotage is quite interesting, and we're going to return to it. But this issue of the outsider and the insider, this is also to some extent aligned with terms like black hat and white hat hackers, where the black hat is someone who is outside of the system and hacks in and is oftentimes considered to be destructive, whereas the white hat would be someone who has been hired by the company or the government that is building the system and then tests that system for vulnerabilities using a lot of the same techniques of a so-called black hat hacker. And of course there are famous stories of people switching sides from one to the other, especially of someone who is an outside hacker who gets in and then is hired to run security for a company. So that's quite complicated. I tend to think that the prototypical image is of the outsider, though now it's quite funny. There are schools that offer programs to become a certified ethical hacker, where that's essentially training to be a white hat. And the certification, it has a number of criteria and standards associated with it. So let's look at another one: professional and amateur. This notion of being an outsider tends to be associated in some sense with the idea of the amateur. Now, amateur is tricky because that doesn't mean you lack expertise necessarily. I think that oftentimes when we think of hackers, it may even be someone who is a computer professional in some sense, but that the hacking is not what they do professionally. The hacking is what they do for fun or in their free time, and is in that sense an amateur activity. But we also have this sense that hacking is in some ways virtuosic, right? That the hacker is almost a kind of visionary figure who can see through all these opaque walls and systems and get in where no one else could. We tend to think of amateurs as novices. So this is just another area where I see some tensions in our associations with the term. The hacker has also oftentimes been understood as an anti-capitalist kind of figure. Someone who, does not work for the banking system, but rather breaks the banking system, so to speak. Someone who erases financial data, oftentimes, kind of working as Robin Hood figures and things like that, at least in the world of fiction. And yet, we also, we need to get our arms around the reality that oftentimes the word hacking is these days used for kind of entrepreneurial activities, and that's not always in the sense that pirates are entrepreneurial. I mean, if you go and visit Facebook's campus, the word hack and the word hacker are everywhere in the sort of internal advertising and motivational posters. The so-called hacker ethic is something that has been embraced by some of the biggest and most powerful companies in the world at this point. And so the notion that hacking is an inherently anti-capitalist activity seems really quite thin at this point. Another issue is this distinction between play and work, which again is related in some sense to the capitalist versus entrepreneurial distinction and the professional versus amateur distinction. I also want to talk about destruction and creation. Sal, who's going to speak to you next, she said to me a while ago that the easiest thing for a hacker to do is destroy, because they're outside of the system, and so it's inherently easier to break it, especially without the at least the official knowledge of how things are supposed to work. And I think to some extent that's true, and yet we also use this notion of hacking to talk about making things, right? I mean, at Facebook, when they say, oh, everybody's hacking, or when people host hackathons and things like that, they're not talking about destruction. They're talking about writing code. One thing that does tie together a lot of these different things, I think, is a notion that hacking happens fast, right? Like, we often speak of a quick hack as a program that is thrown together. It's not the most beautiful thing. It's maybe not the shortest thing. It's maybe not the most efficient implementation of code to achieve a particular purpose, but it works, right? And in a funny way, this gets back to the play and work distinction, but that's not actually what I meant by work in that case. But, one does not think of a hacker as working slowly. Even in the case where the work is virtuosic, we tend not to think of it as meticulous as much as maybe work that is done in a flow state or something like that. Hacking, I think, is always done fast. It's quite complicated, this destruction and creation, perhaps also related to notions of unintended use versus intended use. When we talk about hacking something, it's not always hacking a computer. We also talk about life hacks, right? And that, again, is a question of speed, but it is also a question more of creation rather than destruction. Another example that straddles this line in quite interesting ways is the right to repair everything movement, where people are resisting this increasing trend of corporations producing goods that cannot be repaired. They are built with safeguards to prevent people from using them as they were originally intended to be used. And so they're sort of hacking through these safeguards so as to be able to repair things they have purchased and so use them as they were intended, which is also in some ways related to things like DRM, protection of media. There's just one more example I want to talk about very briefly, which this kind of prefigures some things that Marissa will be talking about later, which is there was a Stopping Mass Hacking Act introduced by Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon, and that act, despite referring to hacking in the name by which it is referred to, is actually about preventing warrantless wiretaps by the government. And so this is very interesting to me too. You know, the idea that listening in on the citizens on the part of a government is something that might be called hacking. I found quite insightful something that someone recently said about the decision to hire people to break into iPhones when Apple refused to do it. That is to say, the U.S. government hired people to break into those iPhones in order to get personal information off of them when Apple refused to engineer a backdoor. And in the press, that was talked about as the government hires hackers to break into these phones, to which some people retorted that if you're breaking into something on behalf of the government, you're not a hacker, you're an intelligence contractor. So, in complicated ways, hacking has perhaps been co opted by governments and by corporate life and has lost some of its veneer of being an outsider or anti capitalist activity. Um, on one hand, those are ways in which those skills can be put to good and productive uses. On the other hand, for some people, that's going to make those skills lose their luster. Uh, Nonetheless, I remain optimistic about the potential for hacking also as a productive political force, not only inside of government but outside of it. So now I'm going to pass the mic over to Sal, who's going to talk to us about some more technical aspects of hacking.
So, thanks, Ethan, for your great summary of what hacking is. Next, I'm going to talk about the technical details of how to do a hack. It's a little bit difficult when searching around for famous hacks to find hacks that actually take advantage of interesting technical vulnerabilities. Most data breaches occur because someone purposefully uh, misuses username or password data, or is paid or incentivized to do that. But this bug that we're going to talk about is called Heartbleed, and it's actually utilizes a neat little technical problem that you will be able to understand with just the basics of CS 107. So I just want to establish that Heartbleed is not the most severe nor the most recent security bug. The reason we talk about it is I'm going to quote one of the people who discovered this, which is, I think it had a lot to do with marketing around the bug that Codenomicon is the security company that was discovering it at the same time. A lot of the marketing around the bug that Codenomicon did, a logo and a great name goes a long way. So Heartbleed is basically popular because they made a great little website about it to increase public awareness, and they have a cute logo, and it's also easy to explain. So the first thing we're going to do is look at a tiny piece of code that I wrote to demonstrate the mechanisms involved in the bug. The code that I wrote is not equivalent to the bug. In fact, it's not perfectly analogous to the bug. But we'll look at the exact code involved in Heartbleed later. The idea behind Heartbeat, which is the functional code that Heartbleed is a bug in the Heartbeat code, which is part of the OpenSSL secure socket layer, which is a network communication library. So ideally, the way this is supposed to work is you, the client, are talking to a website like Google or Amazon or some respectable website, and delivering and sending secure communications back and forth. And periodically, your machine wants to just check and make sure that they still have a connection to Google. So your machine sends a little packet of information, kind of arbitrary information, sends it to Google. Google writes that information to a packet and sends it back. And that establishes that we're still talking to Google. So yeah, the goal of Heartbeat is to just take a tiny piece of information, copy it over, send it back to the client. And the code that we're looking at is from the server side. So like from we're looking at it from maybe Google.com's perspective or Amazon.com's perspective. So let's take a look at my little tiny piece of code here. I'm calling it IO Heartbeat. Okay. So we look in main here, and we see that it's going to read in arguments from the user. And the arguments, I'm just going to tell you now, are in the form of a text file. That's the little clump of client data that we talked about. And then an additional piece of information, which is the size of that file in bytes. So when the client calls IO Heartbeat, they're going to give it the name of a file that holds the clump of data they're trying to send to the server and the size of that data. 2 arguments. So in line 26, we read in that size. In line 27, we open up the file. And then I'm going to skip line 30 for a second and jump right to line 32. In line 32, we, and when I say we, I'm talking about the respectable website like Google or Amazon, or a number of other websites, allocate space to store this information that is the little clump of data that came from the, maybe untrusted source. So we malloc that space, and then we read in data from the file into that space using fread. And then we print it back out to the console. So let's just see how this works when it's being used benignly. So I have this file in this directory called data.txt. So let's take a look at that. Actually, let's cat it. Data. Okay, so this file just has the 3 letters hi. So I will call IO Heartbeat, and I'll say that here's the little piece of data, and it has 4 bytes, right? Because we're going to include the null terminator. And then, oh, I'm giving a little bit away here. So the IO Heartbeat has responded with the same package plus a character. I should actually use 3 here because the size gets used as an index in the code. We'll take a look at that later. Okay, so I say, here's the data, here's the size of the data, and IO Heartbeat responds with, here's your data back. I'm just going to print it out. Let's go back into heartbeat.c. Okay. So if you haven't noticed already, we're trusting the caller to give us the right size. If they give us a size that's too small, like let's say just 1, then we just print 1 character even though they sent us a whole 3 characters. That's not terrible. But what if they give us a number that's bigger than the number of characters that's actually in their data? So we're just going to like print characters out of the buffer. We're gonna print that number of characters out of the buffer. For instance, if they give us the number 7, we'll print 7 characters off of the heap, even though there are actually only 3 characters that came from that file. So it's kind of a mystery, like what's in the rest of the heap? And I've set this up so that there's actually some data in the heap that we don't want them to access. Here on line 30, I call a function called read sensitive data. And we can look up at line 7. Read sensitive data reads this file called sensitivedata.txt. It puts it onto the heap, then it frees that pointer so it's available for use, and it exits the function. So the heap potentially has data that we do not want a caller to see. And then we go ahead and we use the heap again, and we print things out from the heap. So let's go ahead and try this out. I'm going to say, I'm going to lie and say that I have 7 characters of data. Okay, so we get a little bit of garbage at the end. That's definitely nothing we care too much if the caller sees that. But let's pick a bigger number than 7. Let's pick 2048. Oh my god. So we got maybe 20 characters of garbage, and then we see the data that was read in earlier from the private data.txt. So we have my username, my password, my date of birth, my account number, the name of my first pet. All this stuff was just sitting on the heap, and we've accessed it and printed it out for some completely rando caller of this function. All right, so if you are okay with that, then what we're going to do is we're going to move on to the actual code of OpenSSL. So this code was being used by all kinds of websites. In fact, almost all websites in 2014 were using OpenSSL. And this is the actual code that was getting used, t1lib.c. Oops. All right. So a lot of this is not relevant to the Heartbleed bug, but I'm going to point out the things that are. The way t1lib.c works is we get this pointer p to the caller's, or I guess the client data, and we set up this unsigned int called payload, and this is going to be analogous to the variable size in my little code example. Line 16 is a little complicated. It's actually a macro, even though it's not in all caps like you're used to seeing macros in all caps. And it fills the variable payload with the first 2 bytes from p interpreted as a number, as an unsigned int. So this is client data that's getting a little 2 bytes of client data. The first 2 bytes of the client data is getting interpreted as the size of that data and being stored in payload. So just keep in mind that payload, the value that's in payload, did not come from us. It came from the client. And then scroll down to the next thing that's relevant to us. Okay, 37 here, we have a call to open SSL malloc. So this is just like regular malloc as far as the function prototype is concerned. We put a size in and we get a pointer out. So the size that we put in is payload plus some padding. But that payload, again, is a value that came from the client. We're just trusting that it's right. And then we have BP equals buffer, so BP is now what we want to pay attention to. And then the next thing that happens that's relevant to this is memcopy. We copy the client pointer. We copy the data from the client pointer into that buffer according to the size payload. So if payload is too big, we're going to copy too much, we're going to copy more data than is actually there, which means we're going to copy also some of our own data into the buffer. And then lastly, we're going to write those bytes and send them off back to the client, and they're going to have private information about the website or about our code that we didn't want them to have. One of the important features of the Heartbleed bug is that the biggest number that you can store in 2 bytes, or the biggest number you can store in 2 bytes, which is 16 bits, is the number 65,000, roughly. So a client can potentially get little dumps of 65,000 contiguous bytes at a time. Let's see if I can get back over here. This is similar to somebody said it's like panning for gold. They're going to get, for the most part, they're going to get garbage. And if they request frequently enough, they could potentially get usernames and passwords, things like that. And then in the worst case scenario, they could get parts of the private encryption key for the website, which would give them the power to read any data sent to the server or received from them, or sent to them, or coming from them in the past or in the future up until they change their private encryption key, and it leaves no trace because it's just normal protocol. It doesn't break any rules to do this thing where you ask for too much data from the server. That's all I have, and I'm going to pass it on to Marissa.
So we've heard a bit about the history of hacking from Ethan. We've heard a bit about some of the technical aspects of several important hacks over the past few years from Sal. So I'm going to talk now for a few minutes about the present and possible future of hacking, and I'm going to do that by a look and a discussion at one of the most notorious groups of hackers that has emerged over the past 5 years, and that group is Anonymous. And I'm going to use this discussion of Anonymous to take a look at some of the politics of hacking today by looking at the example of the activities that Anonymous has been participating in. And I should note that this is not necessarily a representative sample of hacking and hacktivism and the intersection of hacking and political action on the contemporary scene, but it's a very interesting and prominent example, and that's the reason that I'd like to focus on Anonymous today. So this is the image that we have come to associate with Anonymous. The first question that one needs to ask when considering Anonymous is what or who is Anonymous? As their name implies, this is a group or an entity or an organization, between scare quotes, that defines itself by a lack of identity in some ways. So if we borrow some kind of prominent definitions or descriptions of Anonymous, Wikipedia, for example, has a helpful way of describing Anonymous, and I mentioned their description of Anonymous because I think it's fitting that we borrow a crowdsourced description of who or what Anonymous is, considering that Anonymous, as their tagline goes, is Legion. Wikipedia says that Anonymous is, quote, a loosely associated international network of activist and hacktivist entities. It's also been described as an internet gathering with, quote, a very loose and decentralized command structure that operates on ideas rather than on directives. So what's interesting about Anonymous in the context of the politics of hacking is, first and foremost, I think that Anonymous really represents an entirely new kind of social and political entity. So as its name and as the definition that I just gave you, the description that I just gave you rather, suggests, this is an entity that has no leaders, it has no representatives. You see that their logo is this headless man, a question mark in the place of a face. It has no identifiable spokespersons. So Anonymous, by extension, has no clear ideological or organizational platform. There's nothing you can put your hand on and say, this is Anonymous. And yet, or we might maybe say, and so, Anonymous has emerged as an incredibly powerful force in the international media and the international politics and on the international technology scene. So here we have an example of one of the kind of characteristic activities that Anonymous is taking credit for. This is a parody page for the notorious fundamentalist group Westboro Baptist Church, which many activists and civil rights organizations have advocated describing as a hate group rather than a religious group that should be protected in terms of religious civil liberties. Anonymous is famous or infamous for, on the one hand, activities like this one. So hackers calling themselves anonymous have been linked to pranks and trolling incidents like this parody page or the now famous Habbo Hotel prank, where a bunch of members of Anonymous digitally occupied a Finnish virtual platform that was popular with teenagers and basically just caused a ruckus there, blocking the teenagers' access from this virtual pool and this kind of thing, creating a lot of fuss. So on the one hand, we have this association of anonymous and hackers associated with or calling themselves anonymous with these kind of immature or at best satirical and parodic actions. And the press often covers the actions of hackers participating in these kinds of activities and anonymous when they participate in those kind of activities as annoying at best and criminal cyber warfare or even cyber terrorism at worst, as this headline from 2010 suggests. So when hackers associated with groups like Anonymous attack major corporate websites like the distributed denial of service attack that Anonymous claimed or took credit for against PayPal, Visa, and MasterCard in 2010. The press tends to view this as really a matter of criminal activity. So we have Anonymous as prankster, we have Anonymous as a group of criminals causing trouble, doing the kind of political equivalent of throwing a brick through a storefront window during a protest. At the same time, we know that hackers associated with Anonymous have undertaken very large-scale, politically motivated attacks, again, often DDoS or distributed denial of service attacks, on entities that include government agencies, dictatorships, like their participation on behalf of protesters in Tunisia and in Egypt in particular during the Arab Spring, as well as against corporations like PayPal, Visa, Exxon, websites hosting child pornography, and so on. So in general, when Anonymous issues statements explaining their motivation for these kinds of actions, they suggest that they are aligning themselves against various kinds of social injustices. They have come out making statements against corporate greed. So they participated. They played a pretty big role in supporting the protesters at Occupy Wall Street. They come out against government betrayal of their citizens, as these photos of the protests in Tunisia suggest. Anonymous played a very big role helping activists in Tunisia and in Egypt distributing sort of digital care packages to bloggers and coders in across North Africa and the Arab world during the Arab Spring in order to help them get information in and out of these countries when particularly in Tunisia and Egypt, the government was surveilling and at certain points even just completely shutting down internet access or access to certain information sites. Anonymous has also come out against marginalization or oppression of minority groups here in the U.S. And in Europe and Western Europe. As I mentioned, they were supportive of the protests of Occupy Wall Street. They have intervened on behalf of the Black Lives Matter movement. And very recently, they have been involved in helping protesters at Standing Rock. So all of this is meant to suggest that the kind of that the range of activities Anonymous has taken credit for over the past 5 to 6 years have created a situation in the public opinion and in the media where we have to ask ourselves, we can add another binary to the list of binaries that Ethan mentioned earlier. Does it make most sense to consider anonymous as hacks to be legitimate forms of protest, or are they better understood simply as crimes? And the gap between these two portrayals of anonymous as criminals or, in their own self-descriptions in the media as democratic protesters is a really important and interesting part of their public identity and the work that Anonymous is doing, in no small part because we need to remember that Anonymous is, among other things, is a media organization, a media entity, right? So they themselves are participating in shaping their own identity in an extremely active way and in an extremely targeted way that we'll see in a minute when we take a look at some of their own productions. As an aside, this question about various identities of Anonymous in the media and various personas and kind of different portrayals of them in the media is the topic of this very interesting study by Adam Klein, who is a communications scholar. If you're interested in some further reading on the topic of the portrayal of Anonymous in the media, including their self-portrayal, this is a great source for that. Because, as I mentioned before, as I mentioned in beginning this talk, part of the challenge of understanding a hacktivist organization like Anonymous, what it does, and what, if anything, it stands for, comes from the fact that Anonymous is not an organization at all, but is something much more like a movement or an idea. So when individual members of Anonymous have been outed or have self-outed, right, have self-identified in the public, for example, by being arrested for their activities, sometimes something you read in these accounts is that you cannot arrest an idea, right? So Anonymous is not a single person, but it's an idea, among other things. And that fact makes it all the more remarkable that we have the kind of public face of Anonymous activities. When we do hear from them, we hear things like what the activist and blogger Pete Fine has described Anonymous in terms of a do-ocracy. This is an operation in which people who get things done, and that's it. There are no leaders, there are no big shots, there's no celebrities, there's no individualism. So, this is really a revolutionary organizational structure, if we can call it that. Again, I might put scare quotes around the word organizational. It is a social structure, but as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, I think it's really important to think about the radical potential of a group like Anonymous, whether or not we agree with their politics, the way that they align themselves, or their individual, the criminality or productiveness of their individual actions. It's really important to think about the radical potential of a group like Anonymous, and to consider the strategies that they've used that have been successful, as opposed to those that have been less successful, those that have had an impact on the world stage in terms of politics, in terms of legal reform in the area of technology, and so on. And I think it's a testament to how far Anonymous has come and how successful, in some senses, their media and their technical strategies have been, that the use of the name Anonymous has by now very far transcended the kind of geeky, trollish underbelly of the internet, full of pranks like the parody page of the Westboro Baptist Church or the occupation of the Habbo Hotel virtual swimming pool. And we've arrived at this stage. This is what happens when you do a Google image search for anonymous. That's just, you can see there in the browser bar, I've simply typed in the single word anonymous and clicked on images, and every single one of these initial images relates to the iconography and the self kind of propagating imagery associated with anonymous. So you see here the Guy Fawkes mask, which Anonymous has taken up as its faceless representation, that image that I showed you before. Of course, you've got these kind of creepy guys in hoodies behind a computer. This is pretty amazing considering how long the word anonymous has been in use in English, how many other applications there are of this word. It did, of course, cross my mind that they probably hacked the Google algorithm in order to produce these results. But nonetheless, clearly a very influential and important presence in the digital world. This also happened in 2012. Despite being neither a person nor an organization, Anonymous was named one of Time's most influential people. If you can see here, you'll notice that Time's description of Anonymous is as a leaderless internet hive brain. So we can add that to our kind of arsenal of ways of thinking about and categorizing what exactly this entity, this social body that it calls itself Anonymous is, the internet hive brain that has this huge influence, especially in 2012, so shortly after their activities in the Arab Spring. To get a better sense of the shape that Anonymous's hacktivism takes and the iconography and branding that they present, I want to take a minute to hear a little something from Anonymous itself, as it were. Here's a very short 2015 video that was released shortly after the Paris attacks earlier that year.
2015, notre pays, la France, fut attaqué à Paris vers 22 heures par de multiples attentats terroristes revendiqués par vous, l'État islamique. Ces attentats ne peuvent pas rester impunis. C'est pourquoi les Anonymous du monde entier vont vous traquer. Oui, vous les vermines qui tuent les pauvres innocents. Oui, nous allons vous traquer. Comme nous avons pu le faire depuis les attentats de Charlie Hebdo. Attendez-vous donc à une réaction massive d'Anonymous. Sachez que nous vous trouverons et que nous ne lâcherons rien. Nous allons lancer l'opération la plus importante jamais réalisée contre vous. Attendez-vous à de très nombreuses cyberattaques. La guerre est déclenchée. Préparez-vous. Le peuple français est plus fort que tout, et se relèvera de cette atrocité, encore plus fort, sachez-le. Anonymous présente encore ses condoléances aux familles des victimes. Nous sommes Anonymous, nous sommes Légion, nous ne pardonnons pas, nous n'oublions pas, attendez-vous à nous.
So I wanted to show you this sample of their communications so you could have a sense of the kind of characteristic and I think highly effective kind of anti-brand branding that Anonymous has used to kind of propagate this image of itself in the popular imagination and in the media. So you have this mixture of kind of at moments funny, at other moments very serious, and always eerie imagery. We have this anonymized, computerized voice, the Guy Fawkes mask that Anonymous has borrowed, as I mentioned before, as their kind of main symbol that you see, came from V for Vendetta, probably in its most recent incarnation, but has successfully transcended this virtual representation and has been a characteristic feature of many of the on-the-ground protest activities that members of Anonymous have participated in over the years. This ranging from their early protests of the Church of Scientology's human rights abuses and corruption, all the way up to, through the Arab Spring, where you saw people wearing these masks, through copyright protests, antitrust and IP issues, all the way up to the present. And so, you get a sense from watching these videos of just how powerful Anonymous's media messaging has become. So, what's I think is so special about Anonymous and the sphere of hacktivism and the contemporary sphere of hacktivism is how effectively they have managed their status as the force of the crowd, the kind of truly anonymous mass, by insisting on being a social zero. So, as I mentioned before, there's some really interesting political and social experiments unfolding under the kind of aegis or umbrella identity of Anonymous that have been justifiably, rightfully capturing the imagination of many contemporary social and media theorists and really making them a force to watch. The last thing I want to mention about Anonymous, by way of concluding, before I get to some final questions that I think this discussion of them has raised, is that we can also think about some of one of the more concrete things that Anonymous has one of the more concrete conversations and reform suggestions they've spurred in the public sphere is the idea of thinking about DDoS or distributed denial of service attacks as a form of electronic civil disobedience. Now, this is another really radical idea. As you know, a DDoS is a technique by which hackers use a kind of coordinated attack of, attack between quotes, a coordinated effort to flood any given website with traffic. So as to essentially crash that site and make it unusable. And in recent years, lawyers and people representing hackers associated and not associated with Anonymous have argued the case for thinking about DDoS as a form of electronic civil disobedience in the same way that we would think about a sit-in as a legitimate form of social protest in a democracy, right? In which you have the classic example of students lining up in the hallways of the administrative buildings at the University of California, Berkeley in the 1960s, flooding into the space essentially for the exact same reason as a DDoS in order to prevent business as usual from going on there. So we consider this to be a valid form of protest. So I mention this because I think this kind of brings us, again, by way of conclusion, to some really interesting questions raised by the activities of Anonymous. Namely, what constitutes a valid form of protest in the social sphere and the political sphere that is the internet? And how do we evolve new standards for evaluating democratic practices in the information age? Because after all, the internet is, of course, a social sphere. It's a social sphere that affects the political, the social, economic, and material spheres in real life. And so we have to really take activities like this seriously. We have to kind of consider that we're now facing a vastly new set of social practices here. And these practices demand that we bring kind of the full force of our political and ethical work to bear on them. So thank you so much for your attention.